Would you live on $133 a month for food?
I should try it because you know how fabulous I'd look. I'd be so skinny. I mean, camera adds 10 pounds. It really does. I would be looking great.
We really messed up. And we're all very sorry. I personally apologize to you if that happened.
I'm the worst journalist in the world!
The White House soup of the day, my favorite radio guy in Fort Lauderdale, it's minestrone chicken sausage.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
Guys, I'm Abby Martin. This is Breaking the Set. So yesterday, newly elected Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel gave his first major policy address, and shockingly, he actually had some sensible things to say, starting with the fact that he's concerned that, quote, the military's modernization strategy still depends on systems that are vastly more expensive and technologically risky than what were promised or budgeted for. In fact, he put the entire Pentagon on notice, saying that they need to prepare for sweeping and dramatic cuts. But that's not all. He even went on to say, quote, most of the pressing security challenges today do not necessarily lend themselves to being resolved by conventional military strength. Wow, seems like he may understand that we can't keep bombing our way out of every conflict. All right, this is a good start, acknowledging the reality of our completely unsustainable military-industrial complex and how ludicrous the bombing for peace mentality really is. However, Hagel continued to reinforce how terrorism is a real threat facing this country, and he emphasized that the military remains an essential tool of American power. But keep in mind, this is the same tool that's so massive that it stands bigger than the militaries of the next 10 countries combined. So, until Hagel starts invoking draconian budget cuts and initiates the closure of world bases, I see this as nothing more than cheap talk. Hagel, put that budget money where your mouth is, and let's break the set. On the heels of Cyprus's staggering bailout and Detroit's economic downturn, Stockton, California has just declared bankruptcy. Stockton is home to about 300,000 people, making it America's largest city to have filed thus far. Yep, the Chapter 9 bankruptcy application was accepted by a judge this past Monday in order to allow the city to continue operating. According to city officials, the biggest debt owed is to the California Public Employees Retirement System, a debt of $900 million that has been allocated to pensions. However, the city is deliberating on whether they can actually get out of bankruptcy without going after the promised pensions. It's a situation that's all too reminiscent of Vallejo, California, a city of 116,000 people that filed bankruptcy in 2008 when facing a $16 million deficit. Although they escaped millions of dollars in debt from the bankruptcy, the city was unable to retool its pension plan, which to this day remains an unfunded liability of $165 million. So despite the city's miscalculated funds and the giant bank's risky investments, the average citizen is the one who suffers. Interestingly enough, the attack on pensions mirrors the terms that the IMF is now setting for Cyprus moving forward. So to talk about all of this, how it all fits together, and the dangerous precedent it sets for the world, I'm joined now by Jason Burmas, independent journalist and host at unboundradio.com. Jason, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Abby. And this is very alarming. If you look at the terms that the IMF is now setting for Cyprus, they're talking about going into bank accounts there and taking a 40 to 80% haircut, although they're saying they're only going to go after accounts that are 100,000 euros or more. But at the same time, you read this article and it says that the poorest will be spared the worst cuts, but not all of these cuts. All of this at the same time when they're saying they're going to have to retool their pension plan and actually raise taxes. Now, going back to Vallejo, California in 2008, when they declared bankruptcy, they were told within a few years they would be back in the black and not in the red, and that just has not happened. So now they're being asked to retool their pensions as well. And the main focus in Stockton, California, which is a huge microcosm for the rest of the country at 300,000, basically around 1 in 100 people, you know, if you believe that we have about 300 million people here, that they're going after their pensions as well. So what we're seeing is people that have been fiscally responsible, that have been planning for the future, that have put money away, no longer have that to fall back on, and the state is going to come in and just take it.
Why are they doing this when they've said that specifically that they're not going to go after the poorest? I mean, how is it that they're able to do this, Jason?
And that's the real question. How are they able to say that this bank is too big to fail? But we're seeing it more and more, and we're seeing it in the backdrop. For instance, those people that had no idea that their bank accounts were going to be subject to a bank holiday and now this quote-unquote haircut really have nothing that they can do. They have to sit back and watch, or they have to get out on the streets and protest. And we've seen that in Europe before with the situation in Greece, but you're not seeing that in the United States. And I think it's high time you start seeing that before they start raiding pension funds here. Another alarming aspect of this Cyprus situation is that it seems to be the model now for other westernized first world nations.
Well, let's talk about what you're going to say. You're going to talk about Canada, and I wanted to actually read a piece of this new economic recovery plan that you just tuned me into, Jason. They just proposed their economic action plan for 2013, and it seems like they are using Cyprus's model for their new strategy. In it, it says, this regime will be designed to ensure that in the unlikely event that a systematically important bank deletes its capital, the bank can be recapitalized and returned to the viability through the very rapid conversion of certain bank liabilities into regulatory capital. Jason, break this language down, and also, I mean, what does this essentially mean for the rest of the world here?
Well, first of all, they word it with all sorts of rhetoric, and you can find this on pages 144 and 145, and I encourage people to look into it, because they're naming these quote-unquote significant banks, but not naming which banks they would be. And obviously, the parliament would decide which banks they are, but those would be the large conglomerate banks. And they're saying to us, well, don't worry, we're going to save the taxpayers in case that these banks go into default. Still, they're going to save the banks, but they're also going to save the taxpayers. Now, how are they going to save the taxpayers? They are going to go in to the capital funds that are there from bank accounts and the other resources that they have. In other words, the land they own, the property they own, that will all become liquid capital to these quote-unquote significant banks if they were to fail. And there has been no discussion about this across the board in the mainstream media. And these are our neighbors to the north. If they adopt a system like this, we're going to become familiar with a new term, not bail out, but bail in. And bail in means the banks can literally use your bank account to recapitalize theirs because they were derelict and they spent too much.
Unbelievable, Jason. Instead of looting the taxpayer funds for the bailout, they're just going to go straight in our bank accounts and take it themselves. Absolutely astounding what's happening in the rest of the world and what precedent Cyprus sets really for this global system. Let's talk about Cyprus. I mean, you just mentioned that initially people were being told that they'd lose about 10% of anything over $100,000 in the bank. But according to the Washington Post, I mean, losses could now reach as much as 80%. I mean, that's insane to think about. Do you really think all of this money will be confiscated?
I pray that it is not going to be confiscated, but with the way the media is reporting on this, I am definitely not putting it past them. And let's not forget, in this situation, not only are they raiding the private accounts of these Cypriots, they are also raising taxes 2.5% and raiding the pension funds, also going after the social welfare system. And we haven't even seen what the IMF plans to do in those two instances. This is very alarming. We are literally giving up our sovereignty, our rights, our political actions to these banksters, the IMF, the World Bank, these organizations that are supposed to be helping us, but instead they are gutting the regular populace.
They are, Jason, and of course the financial elite, the banking elite, all over the world removed their money from Cyprus before this happened. They knew what was coming. We see this time and time again. And obviously this is a global precedent, as we're talking about right now. Do you think that we could see something like this happen in the U.S., Jason? And if we do, what should we do to prepare for this? Because the banking establishment and global elite have clearly thrown everyone under the bus, and they will continue to do so.
Well, to think that it can't happen here is just ignorance at this point, especially when you have the Canadian government now actually writing it into their economic plan of action in 2013 in case such a situation does arise. If people want to protect themselves, now is the time to withdraw the majority of your money in these bank accounts, to stop paying into 401k and pension plans that may not be guaranteed, not only 5, 10, 20, 30 years down the line. We're talking about in the next couple years. I would say protect yourself with hard assets and really look at the global economy right now. There's a reason that Bitcoin is exploding through the roof, because people no longer trust the banking systems. If you look at the way that Bitcoin has risen to the top of the financial markets in just a few weeks, it is directly correlated with this Cyprus situation.
But Jason, despite all this economic instability, despite the obviousness of what you're pointing out that seems to be rippling around the world and is inherent in the system, the leader of the World Bank just came out and said extreme poverty could be wiped out by 2030. I mean, what does this absurd optimism mean in terms of looking at the economic model that is completely inherently unequal and designed to inevitably collapse?
It just shows you that we do really live in an Orwellian super state where the media can literally promote the exact opposite of what is going on in reality. And if you see this president of the World Bank who spoke before Georgetown University, he stated that within 17 years, 1.3 billion people that are in extreme poverty will no longer be in that extreme poverty because of the positive economic outlook globally. So what we have is a media propaganda machine promoting global banks like the World Bank and the IMF while they got the general populace. And then when large banks like JP Morgan Chase, for example, sell off derivatives and then make money on the back end betting against them during the 2008 financial crisis, well, they go to court and they beat the system. Jamie Dimon just got off yesterday in the first trial against Dexia. So it is rather disheartening that you're seeing, again, the banks propped up as saviors, and when you bring them to court for their illegalities, they have all the money in the world to fight it, and they barely, if ever, get a slap on the wrist.
And of course, the structural adjustment policies from the IMF and World Bank designed to keep the third world in perpetual poverty, to prop up the first world, keep these people as rich as they ever have been and ever will be. Thank you so much, Jason Burma. It is truly Orwellian, and I thank you for coming on, breaking down some of the rhetoric. Host at unboundradio.com. Everyone check it out. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Well, if you like what you see so far, check us out on Hulu at hulu.com/breakingtheset. There you can watch the latest episode of the show, like yesterday's, which featured Norman Solomon, co-founder of rootsaction.org. You can also scroll through and watch every show since about the middle of December. So go favorite us and comment on how we're doing at hulu.com/breakingtheset. Now I take a break from my preaching, but stay tuned to hear from Eugene Purer, organizer with the Answer Coalition on North Korea and the legitimacy of the threats we've been hearing next.
I got news for you, gang. The world is round.
That's a good one, Mac. Thank you. The news begins immediately. With more attacks, all that breaking news is
Casualties in Iraq. There's my kid. Don't tell me how much time I spent helping him. The Prime Minister. So you say no foreign aid whatsoever to anyone. Watch what happens. Coming up next. This is a Fox News.
Let me ask you a question.
No, let me ask you a question.
Here, on this network, is where we're having the debate. We have our knives out.
The issue is the surveillance state.
How do you justify staying there as a guest?
We are in a situation where the entire...
I didn't agree to talk about the surveillance state.
I want you to watch what we're about to do, because you've never seen anything like this on television.
Over the last few weeks, the nuclear-armed North Korean government has been making a series of threatening declarations against the U.S. While intelligence analysts say the threat of nuclear war is minimal, the war rhetoric from high-level North Korean officials is not letting up. And as a result, the U.S. announced that in a precautionary move, they'll be speeding up the deployment of advanced missile system defense to the region in the next few weeks. This following a series of U.S. training exercises in South Korea as a show of military strength. including sending B-2 stealth bombers, each of which cost taxpayers more than $3 billion. But wait! Before you run for your bunkers, it's important to understand the legitimacy of these threats and the context of why they're happening in the first place. So to help us dig deeper into just that, I'm joined now by Eugene Purrier, I can never say your last name, organizer for the Answer Coalition. Thank you so much for coming on, Eugene.
Great to always great to be here.
So, Eugene, for people who are freaking out right now, I'm seeing it all over corporate media that North Korea is going to attack us with nuclear weapons. How likely is this scenario?
Well, I think it's not very likely that North Korea would attack us with nuclear weapons. I mean, the one thing that the government and the media is consistently skipping over is we don't even know if North Korea has miniaturization technology to put nuclear weapons on a warhead to even launch them at the United States. So, well, I think this is a very serious threat that's going on in terms of world peace. I don't really think that there's an imminent threat of nuclear war between North Korea and the United States.
And some declassified documents actually revealed that the Pentagon was planning to drop a nuclear weapon on North Korea during the Korean War. What made them not do this, and are they still planning to potentially do this preemptively?
Sure. Well, I mean, we know that even in recent days, Robert Gates, when he was the Secretary of Defense, even said that all options are on the table when it comes to North Korea. So we know that from the Korean War on, the United States has made this a very important part of its strategy. I mean, Douglas MacArthur even said that during the Korean War, he had a plan to drop 30 to 50 atomic bombs on the border between North Korea and China to help the United States win the war. Even during the armistice talks between the United States and the so-called United Nations forces and the North Koreans, they were considering using nuclear weapons on that country. So obviously, if there's going to be any threat of nuclear war between North Korea and the United States, it's going to be on the part of the United States.
Yes, indeed, the only country that's ever dropped nuclear bombs to it that during a wartime. But the media doesn't seem to be talking about the other side of this hostile situation. U.S. sending stealth bombers, live fire exercises between the U.S. and South Korea, or the UN imposing sanctions over and over again. Is North Korea simply responding to the threats that have been happening for the last couple of years?
I think so, without a doubt. I mean, not to mention there was a war between North Korea and the United States, and the United States was extremely brutal. But I mean, in the past decade, just the past decade, we've seen the United States invade Iraq, Afghanistan, wage war in Somalia, all across the African continent, all across Asia. Recently do the Asia pivot, where it significantly put more troops in, Australia and other countries, moving all sorts of weapon systems, including the F-22 stealth fighter, to the Korean Peninsula, selling drones to South Korea. So all we can see really is the United States, the most powerful country in the world, with the preponderance of force on its side, continuing to tighten the screws economically with sanctions and build up its military force and its saber rattling. So I think North Korea, looking at what's happened to Iraq, what's now happening to Syria, what's happened to Afghanistan, has to see Libya, for instance, who supposedly, won or learned the lessons of Iraq by eliminating their weapons of mass destruction program. President Gaddafi, or Muammar Gaddafi, was still taken out of the picture. So the North Koreans certainly, I think, are responding to the trend of the United States over the past decade to overthrow any regime that stands in its way.
And I think that this all begs the question, why? Why does the U.S. have such a prevalence to do this, especially in this region of the world, Eugene?
Well, I think North Korea is one of those nations that in the post-war period decided to choose a different development path, a path of socialism, not capitalism. And all countries that decided not to go the capitalist road were targeted by the United States, really for destruction, for showing that there's a different way other than the capitalist U.S.-led road of development. And I think North Korea, the hostility between the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is really rooted in this difference. The fact that North Korea, whatever the issues going on in the country, still stands as a sign of independent development. The idea that you can do it differently, that it doesn't have to be just like the United States says, that you don't have to kowtow to their every single wish. And for the United States, this is extremely dangerous because if other countries start to feel this way, it threatens the hegemony of the U.S. imperial strategy.
Absolutely. Their defiance to the global order imposed by the world hegemon, Eugene. But, I just read today that North Korea has actually proposed continued efforts for a peace treaty in the past. It kind of flies in the face of everything that we're told, that North Korea is this hostile nation. If this is true, why hasn't this proposed peace treaty come to fruition?
Well, because the United States isn't interested in peace. I mean, as we know, or as many people in America do not know, one of the key negotiating points for the North Koreans has always been to sign a peace treaty. Only an armistice has been signed. The United States refuses to sign a peace treaty because they feel they have no interest in a peaceful resolution of the North Korean issue, because then North Korea would be free to to not spend all their money on the military, not have to be consistently concerned with being invaded by the United States and by South Korea and other nations allied with America. It would be able to, at least potentially, prosper. And that would send the wrong message. It would send the message that independent countries, countries that are non-capitalist, countries that decide not to kowtow to the United States and Western nations, could in fact succeed. And so by keeping up the pressure on North Korea militarily and by sanctions, it sort of forces them into a fortress-like mentality, which makes it look like the least desirable place in the world to live, and that's very valuable to U.S. propaganda in terms of saying to other countries, you should do what we say.
Of course, other client states like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, egregious human rights violators. We don't hear much about that, Eugene, but we constantly hear about North Korean human rights abuses. But I think the Korean War, when people think about this, it's totally forgotten, almost omitted from the discussion of what really happened. 5 million dead, carpet bombing for years in the country. And since then, I mean, people don't even realize that Korea used to be a unified country. I mean, talk about the demilitarized zone and how the people don't even necessarily want that. They want unification.
Certainly, people do want unification in Korea, and there's a strong movement in South Korea, a pro-peace unification movement that is never written about, but there's 1,000 years of unbroken culture and history in Korea, and that's something that on neither side of the border, I mean, we see that on both sides there's a significant sense of people wanting to reunify, wanting to come back together, but the United States and its super bellicose policy of constantly refusing to resolve the issue with a peace treaty and really denying on numerous occasions the issue of bilateral talks and refusing to remove troops from the Korean Peninsula has continually kept things at a nice edge.
And lastly, you know, it just reminds me of Iran, where we're saying you don't have the right to build a nuclear weapon. Even if they were building a nuclear weapon, why is it that these sovereign nations don't have the right to defend themselves from a nuclear state that has used nuclear weapons in war? We have about a minute left.
Well, for exactly that reason, because then they'd be able to defend themselves. I mean, Iraq kept saying over and over again, we don't have weapons of mass destruction. It didn't help them. Libya got rid of their weapons of mass destruction. Didn't help them. Everyone who the U.S. has targeted in the axis of evil or for regime change, they have to be able to defend themselves or they will be taken out. I mean, that's the lesson. What other lesson could you draw if you're North Korea other than if we don't have nuclear weapons and act like we're going to use them, then we will not be able to appropriately deter people like the United States with thousands of nuclear weapons who seek to dominate the world and who use more military force on a daily basis than any other country in history.
The next 10 countries combined, our military is so massive, and I can't help but think that the sanctions that we're imposing are just hurting the people more than anything. Thank you so much, Eugene Pierre, the Answer Coalition, for coming on Breaking It Down.
Thank you so much for having me.
45 years ago today, one of the most important civil rights activists of the 20th century and one of the most inspiring figures that ever lived was assassinated. I'm talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But the social revolution that he led didn't happen overnight. For years, a civil rights movement had been building in America, one fueled by decades of intolerance and segregation. And it was because of Martin Luther King's steadfast determination that he's most remembered today as a trailblazer for civil liberties. A year after his famous I Have a Dream speech that led tens of thousands to march at the nation's capital, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which banned racial segregation. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed, ensuring suffrage to all African Americans. But King knew racism wasn't the only social ill. He immediately sought to fight for a new struggle unfolding beyond the borders of this country, one of Vietnam. And for the next 3 years, he became extremely outspoken against the war, giving multiple speeches and shifting his focus to the global community, famously stating that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In fact, he became such a threat to the establishment that the U.S. government coined him, quote, most dangerous and effective Negro leader in the country. And despite MLK being constantly hailed as such an important historical figure, at the same time, the establishment was desperately trying to undermine his efforts in every way. King remained under the watchful eye of several national intelligence agencies, subject to COINTELPRO federal surveillance for years. And additionally, recently uncovered correspondence reveals that the FBI had sent Dr. King a threatening letter in 1964 urging him to commit suicide. The letter, published by Letters of Note, is a disturbing message that was accompanied by a recorded audio tape of King allegedly committing adultery. It reads, quote, "You're done. your honorary degrees, your Nobel Prize. What a grim farce. And other awards will not save you, King. I repeat, you are done. It concludes with, King, there's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You're done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is barred to the nation. But even with threats from the highest levels of government, Dr. King remained committed to his path of justice for all, until April 4th of 1968, when he was assassinated by alleged culprit James Earl Ray. Yet, there are many unanswered questions about the FBI's role in Dr. King's death. Over the years, the King family's attempts for a criminal trial were repeatedly denied, even following James Earl Ray's recant of what he claimed was a false confession. But finally, in 1999, a unanimous jury in Memphis, Tennessee found local, state, and federal government agencies guilty to conspiracy to assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The civil trial consisted of over 70 testimonies from witnesses who, one after the other, called into question the original narrative and concluded that James Earl Ray was nothing more than a patsy. King's wife, Coretta Scott, even stated that this jury confirmed what was already suspected by their family. She said it provided their, quote, family with a long-sought sense of closure and peace, which had been denied by official disinformation and cover-ups. Yet, even now, over a decade since that civil case, questioning James Earl Ray's guilt as the lone man who killed Martin Luther King is received as nothing more than a wacky conspiracy theory. But I guess it's easier that way, isn't it? To deny the facts rather than giving them credence. After all, putting up an MLK memorial in D.C. is always easier than putting MLK's real murderers on trial.